Again, lesson number 6. After today, you will all be Talmud, Talmud masters. You know all the secrets to the Talmud. For the video, Talmud. No. Okay. So, just gonna put that. Okay, there we are. Got that going. So, let's begin. We are on page number 211. We're going to talk about the development of the Talmud and how we have from the Talmud, how we get to that until today. So first we're going to take a bit of a step back and take a look at history. So take a look at page 211, figure 6.1. So we begin explaining that from the year 0, meaning 0 from when we received the Torah, and also from, I'm sorry, also in the years. So we begin the way it always was. The Sanhedrin used to have the final say. If you had any questions, it would always be brought before the Sanhedrin, or the rabbinical court in the place or the situation or the time. And then that all changed in the end of the 1st century. And at that point, around the year 200, began the composition of the Mishnah through Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It's about 200 years after that, began the composition of the Talmud. And we talked about that at length, about how the Talmud worked and how that was set up, etc. This way. There we go. And then after that, about 200 years later, around the year 600, was the period of the Gaonim. The Gaonim were sages. The word Gaonim, which means like the wise men, the sages who would answer questions and that were presented to them. And we talked about some of the interesting questions that was presented to them during the period of the Gaonim. So today we're going to talk about what happened from then until now. As you could imagine, most people today, if they want to know how do you follow Jewish law, most people today don't open up a Talmud and say, let me see what the Talmud says about Jewish law. So something happened between that period from then until now. So what exactly took place? So that's what we're going to talk about today, the halachas of the Rif, Rashi, Mishnah, Rambam, and Tosfos, to see how we went from that till where we are. So, as we talked about in lesson 4, you had the work of Ravina, Rav Ashi. Lesson 5, the culmination of the 6th century efforts, and anything that was once upon a time when they would refer to a question in the court of Jerusalem, that all changed. By the time the Gemara was finalized, you had thousands of halachic questions that had to be examined, debated, resolved. And one thing that did take place was that whatever happened in the time of the Mishnah, whatever was published in the Mishnah, that becomes binding for all people. And this is why the Gemara had a very profound impact on 15 centuries that followed from when the Gemara was made, because the Gemara does become the final say. The next few texts that we have is from an introduction of the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, his introduction to his magnum opus, Maimonides, his 14 books of the Mishnah Torah. And he gives an introduction explaining why he wrote the books, which we're going to get to soon, But first, he gives a little introduction of how everything took place, and a lot of the information comes from there. And in a little bit, I'll explain to you how that's very significant to today, specifically as in Ravina and Ravashi, text number 1. Ravina, Ravashi, and their colleagues constituted the end of an era of the sages who authoritatively transmitted the oral Torah and who set in place ordinances, decrees, and customs that became accepted as normative practice by all Jewish people. By contrast, any ordinance, decree, or custom instituted by any court that arose after the Talmud in any land, whether it was instituted for the inhabitants of the land or for the entire region, did not become accepted as normative by the entire Jewish people. Therefore, if one of the post-Talmudic scholars taught that in a specific case, the judgment ought to be a certain way, and then a latter court subsequently determined that the earlier ruling was an accurate interpretation of the Talmud, we need not follow the earlier conclusion. We follow whichever ruling is more logically correct and in greater ordinance with the Talmud, whether its author lived in an earlier or later generation. All decisions recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, however, are obligatory upon the entire Jewish people. So, once it's working. Oh, I know why it's not working. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, what we need to know here is the conclusions of the Talmud are binding, and rulings that issued after the Talmud conclusions by one halachic authority are not binding on other halachic authority. And that's how we understand that you could have people that come from different places that may have different customs, as we're soon going to see. But anything that is in the Talmud is binding for everyone. And we'll soon explain why that is and how that happened. So again, these are the two very important points that the Rambam is telling us here. First of all, that anything that we read about, for example, we read about eating on Erev Pesach. So that is a law, whatever is the conclusion of the Talmud, whatever is the conclusion of the Gemara regarding eating on Pesach, that is something that is binding for all people, for all times. Now, if there would be something that is a more specific issue with that regard, then that is something that may come differently. For example, the approach of the Yerushalmi, who said that actually we follow Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to follow in halacha, we're going to follow that of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which is that we follow Rabbi Yossi. Anybody remember what Rabbi Yossi said? He said that on all holidays you're allowed to eat, and when it comes Pesach, you're not allowed to. We're soon going to see more about that. But there are some that are stringent, even when it comes to other holidays, to not eat. But that not necessarily had the same binding effect as when it comes to Pesach. Because the Talmud comes to the conclusion that we follow Rabbi Yossi, who says that it's specifically on Pesach where we have that limitation. Now, what happens if a new question comes up? So, you may have different rabbis and different rulings. So, one rabbi, if he's now dealing with a question that's coming up after the Talmud, is not necessarily bound to what another rabbi rules from that period onward. And for that, we have a new term 6.1, in your term sheet called posek or poskim. And this is a rabbi with the authority to render a verdict on a question of halacha. That is the term a posek. Okay. You guys can come in for a second. Everyone welcome. This is my sister and brother-in-law from University of Chicago. I'm sure they would love to. Yes. Her sister, my sister's name is Bela, and my brother-in-law's name is Yossi. And also a happy anniversary to them. It's our anniversary today. Yes. Um, yes, and I want to thank them for coming by here. It's a special treat. Always get to see family. They live in Chicago. They run the Chabad at University of Chicago. So yeah. So all those great minds coming from University of Chicago, you know where they're educated from. The Chabad there. All right. So comes the question: why did the Talmud end? And why did it? Why did Rav Papa feel free to propose the alternative to the Mishnah? And then how did it come to an end? And so the Rambam suggests a historical reason of what took place, of why it was that suddenly we stopped what we know as the Gemara. We stopped that. And so look in text number 2. He continues on. After the era of Rav Ashi, the people of Israel grew increasingly dispersed throughout the world, reaching the furthest geographic extremes and the most remote islands. War became more prevalent and travel was impeded by armed forces. The study dwindled and the students no longer attended yeshivot in their thousands and myriads as before. So the Talmud reflects a unified consensus because at the time most of the Jewish people were living in Babylonia. By way of the side point, it seems that maybe we may be able to see now some of those places with great Jewish history, with Syria becoming more available, which is just an interesting thing that's happening in today's world. It's one of the greatest miracles of the last year that people don't even pay attention to, the fact that Syria was literally just handed over to Israel, half of Syria, not the whole Syria, but half of Syria. Hopefully they'll make the right decisions with it. But yeah. Anyway, so we have the rulings of both the Mishnah and Gemara that represent the true consensus among the sages. But that's not necessarily a unified, but that was a unified consensus. That over time, people started moving to North Africa, Italy, Spain, France, Germany. And so they started developing their own techniques and styles of scholarship. And new halachic questions arrive in each community. And of course, you know, the wars that were going on then, the Byzantines, and you had the Roman conquest and the Crusades and all these things that were going on during those periods, which made communication much more difficult, which made travel more difficult. And what ended up happening was that Jews in their communities started coming up with their own responses based on the rabbis in those communities. And that's, for example, one of the most famous things with regards to Pesach is what we know of as the rice question. But you see, as Jewish people disperse, conclusions reached by one community no longer represent universal consensus. So you had those that were living in communities where rice was more available. So the rabbis in those communities were more concerned, well, rice, not rice specifically, legumes. And they had what's called kitnius, right? And kitnius legumes are things that they said could produce a flour that's similar to wheat flour or whatever, and therefore they said we should not be eating it on Pesach. Whereas in other countries, or not necessarily, they had those things, like in some of the more Sephardic communities, so they never took on those customs until today. That's the way it is. So that's just a typical example, but there are many other examples. Another example is you may find this interesting, polygamy. One of the things that was instituted by Rabbeinu Gershom, and it's something, although nowadays it is accepted by the Sephardim as well, but it was something that wasn't necessarily always by the Sephardim because they were living in communities where polygamy was accepted. Today and still in a lot of the Arab world, it's still accepted. So, just a few examples of how things affected based on the places where you were at and the questions that came up. So now we understand the Talmud's halachic rulings are binding on all Israel. We know that the question about the law, we begin by consulting the Talmud. But now you want to know what to do. Okay? So you want to know, am I allowed to eat an Erev Pesach in the afternoon? Am I allowed to eat on other holidays in the afternoon? So this is a summary of the sugya that we had, page 6.2. You remember the term sugya? So we had the problem. The Mishnah draws a distinction between Passover and the other festivals, including Shabbat, that seems to contradict the view of Rav Yossi, who apparently denies the legitimacy of the restriction under discussion altogether, and also contradicts the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who apparently sees no contradiction between Passover and the other festivals. We have Rav Huna's solution, that Rabbi Yossi draws a distinction between Passover and other festivals. He concludes that the distinction is legitimate in the case of Passover. The Mishnah accords with Rabbi Yossi's view. And this is how the halacha comes. We have Rav Papa, Rabbi Yehuda draws a time distinction between the restriction of the case of Passover and the restriction of other festivals. It begins earlier for Passover. Right? Remember this? He said that the difference is that Passover you have to stop earlier, and other holidays you don't have to end earlier. The Mishnah, of course, review Rabbi Yehuda. Then we brought a second brisa, which says that no, brisa proves that Rabbi Yehuda believes that the restriction timing is uniform for all occasions, and therefore we said that that's problematic. Then Mar Zutra said, well, maybe there's a problem with the brisa. Maybe the brisa is not legitimate. And then we came to the conclusion that no, Maremar said that the brisa is legitimate, and therefore we came to a conclusion that it has to be according to Rav Huna, which Rav Huna says that it's according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says that what? That it's specific, that on all holidays, I'm sorry, not Rabbi Yehuda, and he says that it goes according to Rabbi Yossi, who said that on all holidays you're allowed to eat before the holiday starts. You're allowed to start a meal before the holiday starts. Where it comes Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to start a meal when holiday starts. Now, if you remember, we talked last week that there's actually a dispute between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, right? Remember that? Why? Because the Jerusalem Talmud says that halacha, the law, follows who? Follows who? Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that on all holidays there's a restriction. And in our conclusion in the Talmud here, we said that we follow Rabbi Yossi, which says that on all holidays it's permitted, only on Pesach it's restricted. This is a big difference. Are you allowed to start a meal on Erev Sukkot? Right? Sukkot afternoon, you decide you want to start a meal. Are you allowed to start a meal? So if you're holding according to Rabbi Yossi, you're allowed to. Right? So now, what do we actually do? So we said we follow the Babylonian Talmud. Okay. Now, if somebody wants to know that, do they have to learn through everything that we learned through to come to that conclusion? You're right now here, it's Sukkot, you have some friends that come over, start a nice meal, and you say, am I allowed to start a meal? You say, one second, let me go read through the Sugya and tell me out, can we start a meal on Erev Sukkot or not? So let's take a look at text number 3. The Talmud's manner of expression is extremely profound. Furthermore, it's composed of Aramaic with some other languages thrown in as well. That vernacular was well understood by all Jews of Babylonia during the era in which the Talmud was composed. In other locations, however, and even within Babylonia during the subsequent era of the Gaonim, no one could understand this language without being taught. So that's why you had the Gaonim who would answer questions and halacha questions, and these are the Gaonim. Term 6.2 So the earliest written text that sought to derive halachic rulings from the Talmud's responsa, and various scholars and responses to Jewish questions that would come up, they were known as the Gaonim. You had a number of different Gaons, and the truth is we already talked about them briefly last week. You have Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Shrira Gaon. The Gaon meaning leaders or one of the great Talmudic academics in Babylonia during the 7th and 11th centuries. So they had a unique institutional knowledge of the Talmud. They're regarded as the foremost experts in its text. And as Jewish communities began to expand across the Mediterranean area, they turned to the Gaonim for guidance and halachic questions. And of course, you have a lot of new questions that are coming up. So here are some examples of questions that were presented to the Gaonim. Take a look at figure 6.3. Rabbi Nutrai Gaon. Is the custom of reciting Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur appropriate? Many people ask, where does Kol Nidre come from? As a matter of fact, I will tell you that not everyone recites Kol Nidre. So where does it come from? And so from this question, we don't know exactly where it comes from, but we know that it was already in existence during the Gaon period. So that means from the end of the Talmud era, they were already reciting this Kol Nidre. And there's a lot of questions about Kol Nidre, which is obviously a lesson for now. There are questions about why we even say such a prayer, if you look at the text of what it is. But of course, obviously we do. But the question is, so we have heard this prayer is recited in other lands. However, it's not our custom in Babylonia, is what Rabbi Nutrai Gaon said. So we know that during that period, it's already come from there, because we don't exactly know where the prayer comes from. We know that it existed at some time at that point. Rabbi Yaakov ben Nissen, Orion from Tunisia, said, how and when was the Mishnah compiled? What are Braitot and why are they not part of the Mishnah? Quotes from Rabbi Shrira's lengthy response. We already talked about some of them in this course. We quoted him as explaining some of this question. Rabbi Shrira Gaon also said, is astrology authentic? He said, even if astrology is authentic, it can only determine a particular inclination. However, individuals always maintain the free choice to commit or refrain from a specific action. We actually talked a little bit about this, if you remember. Anybody remember that course? We had a course called Supernatural. Yeah. And we talked a little bit about this, and we brought him down as well there. Rabbi Hai Gaon, also one of the very known Gaonim, Rabbi Balul of Karun in Tunisia. The Talmud explains that there were three distinct customs for shofar sounds on Rosh Hashanah until Rabbi Avo instituted that all three sounds should be sounded. How did such varied practices originally emerge concerning the mitzvot is performed every year? Okay, so what is he talking about? We have three sounds on Rosh Hashanah. We have the long sound, what we call tekiah. We have the shvarm, which is do, right? The three shorter sounds that we have, the tiny sound. Now, the reason that we do this, which of course is not the point over here, but is really out of a question, because we're not sure the teruah, if a teruah is those three shorter sounds or teruah is those tiny sounds. And so because of it, we do both. They're asking a question, what do you mean? Why do both? Why don't we just find out the way they did it? So he writes, all three customs were valid and each community followed its preferred practice. Ravo standardized the practice for everyone to avoid confusion. So we know that Rabbi Ravo standardized this, and therefore this is the way all communities are blowing shofar today, regardless of where you're from. But their question is, why don't we just follow the way it was? And so he says, there were actually different customs, but that's the way it is, which answers in general a question of issues like this, which is, why don't we just find out, how did they blow shofar in the time of Moses? They blew shofar then, they had Rosh Hashanah then, how did they blow it? So the answer is that there may have been different ways of doing it. But when the Talmud came, they then standardized that this is the way all Jewish communities are going to do it from now on. And so that's why we do all the three different versions, which is the three different versions is the three longer sounds, the shorter sounds, and the third version is having both of them together. Okay. Now let's move on. Any questions? No questions. Yeah.
This is all these so with the bill that they own.
No, he was much later, but they adapted that title for him, but he was much later. No, he was, yeah. Vilna Gaon was about 300 years ago. So yeah. Okay. So now with the Talmud recognized as the authoritative source of halacha, now we have to start coming up with legal rulings. So some of these works took place in form of digest, what we'll call a halachic digest. And what they did was they simplified the sugya for readers, allowing them to access the final halachic rulings in a more simplified way. This is referred to maybe as the Talmud Katan, the little Talmud. And one of the most known ones for this is Rabbi Yitzchak El-Fassi from the 11th century, also who lived in North Africa and Spain. He's also known as the Rif. Rabbi Yitzchak El-Fassi, known as the Rif. So there's another term if you want to sound like a yeshiva student. Don't say Rabbi Yitzchak El-Fassi, you just say the Rif. You don't know what you're talking about. Let's take a look at the Rif's work on the Psachim Sugya that we had. So the part that's a little bit lighter is the part that he added in. So he's going to take this entire sugya and he's going to cut it down for us. Text 4a. Mishnah, one must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover from close to the time of reciting mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. In Gemara, we learned in a Braita, one should not eat on the eves of Shabbat or festivals from the time of mincha and onward, so that one enters Shabbat or the festivals with an appetite. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Conversely, Rabbi Yossi says that one may continue eating until it grows dark. Now he adds in, the law follows the view of Rabbi Yossi because there is a rule that the law favors Rabbi Yossi over his colleagues. And our Mishnah regarding Passover Eve concurs with all views because Rabbi Yossi will concede that eating is prohibited on the eve of Passover due to the obligation to eat matzah. So he took the entire long sugya that we had, he condensed it, and he made it available. So now somebody wants to know, what does the Talmud say? Can you shorten it? Give me a synopsis of what the Talmud is saying. This is what he did. So this is what he made. The Harif, Rabbi Yitzchak El-Fassi, a digest that extracted only the relevant halachic conclusions. Now, if you take a look at text 4b, you could see the difference from the things that he cut out. Right? We say, Mama's refraining from eating on the eve of Passover. That he cut out the whole thing. And why does it specify the eve of Passover and the other festivals? That all out. And then he just said, we learned in a brisa, one should not eat on the eve of Passover, right? Then he added in, the law follows Rabbi Yossi. Then the whole thing about Rav Huna this, and Rabbi Yossi that, and Rav Huna, and Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav Papa, and all that. I'm not going to read through this all because we read through it a few times. See, everything is crossed out. He said, let me just give you the final synopsis of what's going on here. Okay? So that is known as the Rif. And throughout the entire Talmud, the Rif did this. He took all these long sugyas, cut them up, condensed it, and said, here's what you have to know from the final ruling, from the final halachic ruling. So, using the Rif's text, answering the following two questions. Is a meal permitted on the eve of Passover, yes or no? Huh? Mm-hmm. No. Is a meal permitted on the eve of Shabbat or other festivals? Yes, because we follow the view of who? Rabbi Yossi, who says that you're allowed to. Okay. So we clearly see that Rabbi Yossi, the Rif, he simplifies the sugya. He presents the brisa. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda disagree. And you see also from here that he does not accept the view of the Yerushalmi and the Jerusalem Talmud. We take on the view of the Babylonian Talmud almost always. And so even though he says that we follow Reb Yossi, but he says Reb Yossi is the one in our Mishnah, and therefore he says that on Passover you're not allowed to, even though he says that all other holidays you're allowed to. So it's permissible to eat a meal on the eve of Shabbat or other holidays. And so if you have some guests coming over on Erev Sukkot, have a meal for them, then you can go ahead and start that meal. And if you're not sure, take a quick look at the Rif and see what he says about the Talmud. Now, how many people are actually going to take a look at the Rif and see what it says about the Talmud? So there are other options as well. And the next one, although the Rif became a staple in Talmudic study, what he really does is helps the student conclude what is taught in the Talmud. Problem is, it's still very challenging because Talmud is lengthy and comes with the lack of explicit conclusions and doesn't always provide a clear, systematic organization of laws. And so so we had another idea that came, not an idea, but another work which was compiled of the Rambam, Maimonides. And the Rambam took the next major step and he produced a halachic code. And what he did was he recognized that as time passes, Talmud is going to become more difficult to read. It's going to become more difficult for people to extract halachas and laws. And so he put everything into a concise book. Took everything and says, in a very clear, orderly fashion, all the laws. And he continues on in his introduction, which we've been reading until now. Continues on in his introduction, text number 5. Therefore, he said, I, Moses, the son of Maimon of Spain, girded my loins. I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. I examined all these texts and set out to compile the conclusions that can be extracted from all these texts as to what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is ritually impure, what is ritually pure, and the rest of the Torah's laws. I will present all the conclusions in a clear language and a concise format so that the entire oral law will be easily accessible to everyone without questions and objections. And he even goes on to say that if you really want, all you have to do, you learn the written law, you learn the written Torah, go straight to my book. That's all you need. And you'll know the entire Torah. And you should. As we will soon see, I will encourage you to read it, but I'm going to get to that soon. So Rambam observed that students of the generation struggled to use the Talmud effectively and as a practical guide for Jewish law. It became very vast and complex. They were having difficulty with the language, with the style. And so even the works of the Gaonim, they weren't presented as like straightforward halachic rulings. There were questions and answers that comes up. So he embarked on really a radical and revolutionary project. Rather than creating a digest, he just went straight and said, these are the halachas. And he was met with opposition at the time. And people found it to be very strange. Here, this rabbi, he's not doing the Talmud anymore. He's just writing things straight up, like law straight up. But this structure was very methodological, and the language was concise and clear. He wrote it in Hebrew, which is actually unique for him because some of his other books he actually wrote in other languages, even in Arabic. He wrote it specifically in Hebrew that it could be mastered by everyone. And halachic conclusions are derived from the Talmud and empower them to know the Torah in a very concise, easy way. So now let's look at the sugya of Pesachim, which we learned, the sugya from Passover that we learned. And the Rambam puts this in laws that he calls the laws of chametz and matzah. Chapter 6 of the laws of chametz and matzah, he says as follows. Text number 6. It is forbidden to eat on the eve of Passover from a little before the time of mincha. See that little thing that he adds in there? A little before the time of mincha. What does that tell you? It says a little before the time of mincha. It doesn't say from the time of mincha. It says a little before the time of mincha. What's that tell you? Huh?
So not a rule.
Yeah, so he's saying a little before that, right? So remember, we brought that down, and then we challenged that with the brisa. So he's saying, follow that opinion too. Stop a little bit before. Okay, so he's sort of kicking in also Rabbi Yehuda's view too. So he's helping out like the Yerushalmi that Yerushalmi says follow Rabbi Yehuda. So he's actually saying, do that too. Anyway, so that we arrive at the eating of matzah with an appetite. He's also giving a reason, which later, Talmud explains the reason. So he's throwing that into here. However, we may eat a small quantity of fruit or vegetables as long as we do not eat enough to feel full, which the Talmud later on discusses that. And so he's now putting this here. And so you don't have to wait till the later discussion in the Talmud for that. And so he's telling you that you have to fast the whole afternoon of Pesach. He's saying you could eat a little bit. You could eat. You could taste that potato kugel that's sitting there, but don't. No, but don't fill yourself up. If you want a good potato kugel, my father-in-law comes here Erev Pesach. He is obsessive about his potato kugel that he makes in Erev Pesach. So by contrast, on the eve of Shabbos or other festivals, he says we may continue eating until dark. Okay, so again, he's very clear. Doesn't mean that you can continue eating straight in until dark. Why until dark? Because once the holiday comes in, you have to. No, other holidays. It says other holidays and Shabbos and other festivals may continue eating until dark, because once it's dark, you have to what? And exactly, you have to make kiddush, right? You're not allowed to eat until you make kiddush. And as I pointed out, this is very relevant this year for the holiday of Purim. People are, people have to know what do you do if you're having a Purim meal? What do? You have to, when it comes time, you have to stop. You have to make kiddush for the holiday. You can't continue eating. So here we have all the different laws. He packs it all in this halacha, making it very clear and concise. And we see that he does that. He also may add in a little here, a little there, that may even change things a little bit from the way we understand it. So he reiterates that it's Pesach Eve is following the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, as understood by Rav Huna, but he also adds in a little bit according to Rabbi Yehuda as well. It's a precise, clear Hebrew, very logical, topical order, provides the reader with a complete and actionable understanding of the law. This is the beauty of the Rambam. Now, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. This is the next part. So this is the Rambam. The Rambam is practical, independent, organized by topic, clear and concise. Now, as generations continued on, the Rambam's opinion was just one of many, because there may be things that are different. Here's one example where the Rambam says a little before the time of Mincha. That's the Rambam's opinion. That's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says from the time of Mincha. So do I have to follow the Rambam or not? The Rambam was a Sephardi. Maybe I don't have to follow the Rambam. The Rambam's code typically presents a single halachic conclusion, which is his own interpretation of the correct ruling based on the Talmud. He will really, and the other issue is he will really include laws that are found in other places, a collection of brisas or other things from, from the Gaonim or from other things. He will really include much of that. So then you had a few of these codifiers. No one did what the Rambam did, but taking the Rif, the Rambam, the Rush, and some others, and you had the next generation. And this is what was known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Shulchan Aruch means a set table. A set table. The set table is a code of Jewish law, and it was presented by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who was a Sephardic scholar who lived in the city of Tzfat at the time, in the land of Israel. Now, one of the most fascinating things about this, because you're talking about the 16th century, so Jews were already very scattered at this time. While he was working on this code of Jewish law, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, there was another great scholar, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, an Ashkenazi scholar from the city of Krakow, and he was also working on his own version of the Shulchan Aruch. And they eventually ended up meeting, and one of the greatest concessions in Jewish history took place. And that is that Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, known as the Ramah, he says, you know what? Rabbi Yosef, we're going to take your book. He took his book and he ripped it up. He said, I'm going to use your book. All that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my view if I argue with you on anything specific. This is why I said it's one of the greatest concessions in Jewish history, because here you have one of the greatest Sephardic rabbis, one of the greatest Ashkenazi rabbis coming together to make one code of Jewish law, which is both for Sephardi and Ashkenazi. And these rules are considered binding for all Jews for that reason. Because you have both the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi rabbi came together for that. And there are certain things that there are different opinions. And then you'll have those that follow either the Sephardi or Ashkenazi, depending on where you come from or whatever. And so this body of work became known as Shulchan Aruch, and it's we could call it the arms bearers, halachic standard for the Jewish world. And so therefore it's considered binding. So let's go through this. Page 6.4. I'm sorry, figure 6.4, page 226. Tshuvat HaGaonim compiled the various collections, including a series titled Tshuvas HaGaonim. Hilchos Harif, which is a halachic digest. Babylonian Talmud, which covers halachic Jews living in the post-temple era. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Then you have the Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides, halachic code covering every halachic subject, including laws relevant only in the temple era. Varying opinions are rarely cited, most limited to halachic questions addressed in the Talmud. And then you have the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, covers only halacha relevant to Jews in the post-temple era. Includes varying opinions, includes halachic questions not addressed in the Talmud. Main text reflects the consensus of Sephardic poskim. The glosses reflect the Ashkenazi consensus. Numerous commentaries round out the halachic spectrum. Shulchan Aruch and its related commentaries represent a consensus of halacha similar to the Talmud. I have a book of the Shulchan Aruch. I don't have it here. I have it in my house. But you can go through it, and it kind of looks like Talmud page, but that's what you have. You have the halacha, and the smaller letters, the Ramah, for Moshe Isserlis, known as the Ramah, will give his insight. Okay, now. At around the same time that the Rif was putting together his work, which is the consensus of Jewish law based from the Talmud, there were also great sages at the time who were putting together commentaries on the Talmud. Because, and this is, as I showed this once to you, this is what the Talmud page looks like. It's just the middle part there, that's the actual Talmud. You have all these commentaries on the side, and we're going to tell you soon what it is. So the first issue is that the Talmud lacks punctuation. If you read it like that, there's no punctuation there. There's no paragraphs. There's no sentences. And this represents a significant challenge to students that are trying to learn. You must determine how to read the text. You have to identify where a question begins, where an answer begins. Now, we have been enjoying the Talmud because we already have been using the commentaries that have helped us understand it. But to give a idea of what this is, we're going to take a look at the sugya that we had from Baba Metzia. Remember, we talked about the workers. Remember that? About the workers who get duped. You remember that? We talked about that. All right, I'm going to have you read text number 7. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to have you read it and tell me how you come, what you come up with. If you could come up with the law. How's that working out for you? Okay, and that's translated into English, so you know what it means. So we're not even dealing with the issue of the language, which is a whole other issue that Talmud is written in Aramaic. So the first thing you have to know the language. Any yeshiva student, that means, has to know at least 2 languages. You have to know Hebrew and Aramaic just to study the Talmud. But let's say you understand the language, this is what it comes out to. So as you can see, this text is practically ineligible. We can't understand the word. It's unintelligible. It's cryptic. So how do we know how to read it? So in order to be able to read it, you have to have guidance. So for what the way it always was, if those wanted to study the Talmud, they would have teachers. They would come to yeshiva. The teachers would say, "This is how you read the Talmud. Now you understand. This is the way you ask a question. This is a question. This is an answer. This is an explanation. There's a question on that, and so on and so forth." And then you're able to decipher its complexities. But as generations passed, particularly the center of the Jewish scholarship shifted from Babylonia to places like Spain and Germany. So not always did you have those teachers on hand, and so commentaries began to emerge. These commentaries would typically cite a word or a phrase in the Gemara and give a brief explanation. The most known is that of Rashi. Rashi stands for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Rashi. Rashi also had a different handwriting. His letters looked a little bit different in Hebrew. So that's another thing that you need to learn how to learn Rashi by first learning his handwriting. It's known as Rashi's script. This is a resh, that's a shin. It's just no, it's just a handwriting. It's his version of script. It's a font. It's a font, right? Today we would call it a font. For computers, it was a way of writing the letters. So this letter is a shin. I'm sure you've never seen a shin like that. But that is a shin in Rashi letters. Normally you see a shin that looks more like that, right? So it's like I said, it's learning a font. So Rashi undertook this very monumental project that he wrote a comprehensive commentary on the entire Talmud. He nearly succeeded, leaving only a few tractates without his commentary at the time of his passing. Of course, we know he wrote a commentary on the Chumash as well, but this is very different, his commentary on the Talmud. Rashi's work was so effective, it became the authoritative guide to Talmud and remained so until this very day, which is why Rashi is the first text that we find on the Talmud page. That is the Rashi. Right there. Okay. You see, it's a little bit, I don't know if I could zoom in here. I don't think I could. Did I zoom in?
Does the commentary on Rashi honest?
Yes, it's the same Rashi. Now this Talmud, you see, he put his heads, he made them a little bolder, but that is what the text of Rashi looks like on the page of a Talmud. Now, the next thing we're going to get to is the other side. Keep that in mind. This is something else. We're going to get to that in a minute. To show you a few things that we won't mention here. Masaras Hashatz. This tells you any other places where you can find these issues discussed. in Talmud. And if you want to know where somewhere else is discussing this in Talmud, so this little corner tells you that. This is a collection of verses. If there's a quote of a certain verse in the Torah. So this will give you the full verse here. So you don't have to open up a chumash, you can have the whole verse here. The Goy's Habat is just if there's certain questions about if a text or a word may have been misprinted or misspelled, you may come up with a correction. It's not always universally accepted, but that's the guidance. It's an addition to Rashi that may have been found later, maybe some other commentaries of Rashi. This is Tosfos, which we're going to get to in a minute. But the other thing I wanted to show you is this, and that is the Ein Mishpat. This is what would reference a law. You see that there's a little aleph there. See that aleph that I'm pointing to, a little tiny letter? Okay. So we'll go to that aleph there. That aleph will tell you, it says Maimonides, which means in Rambam, Perek Yud Mehilchas Chiros, in the 10th Perek of the law of renter. So you could see where Jewish law is going to codify particular law. Take a look at that aleph and I'll tell you where you can find it. Almost always it's going to reference the Rambam. Not always, but typically it would reference the Rambam as your first source, and then sometimes it would say Shulchan Aruch, depending the set table which you talked about, depending on where you could find this law. So what this came much later. Ein Mishpat came much later, but this is just a reference of how you could find what you're learning in the Gemara. You could find it in the law the way it's explained later. So that's what the page is. So I talked about Rashi. Next thing we're going to talk about Tosfos. But first, let's give an example. So if you go back to the text that you just read, so he said, what is the case if the employer said to them at 4 and he went and said to them at 3? So Rashi says, that is not the way you read it. Rashi says you read, what is the case? Question mark. Okay. Now look at text number 8. So Rashi says, what is the case? He says, question mark. What gives them a right to complain about nothing more? Because if you remember, we talked about the idea that we said that you can't take them to court and collect the money. At the same time, you can't say that they have no claim. We said that they have a claim, but it's still a sorry Charlie, even though they have a claim. So Rashi says, when we say what is the case, he's referring specifically saying what gives them the right to complain but nothing. And so now he's helping us understand. So whatever we explained last week was with the help of Rashi. Remember when we were learning Gemara and we asked our teacher, we asked our teacher, who is your teacher? You'd always say, my teacher is Rashi. Until I started learning Gemara on my own, I didn't understand what he meant. But Rashi is our teacher. Some people say Rashi, although it stands for his name, Rabbi Shlomo Yikriki. Some people also read it as Rabban Shel Israel, which means teacher of Israel. Because he is the Rab, he's the teacher of Israel. He teaches them how to learn Gemara. Teaches us how to learn Chumash too, by the way. But that's not today's discussion. So this is Rashi. Is this thing working? Okay, so this is what it looks like in the Talmud. Rashi says, what is the case that gives them the right to complain but nothing more? Next, then you have some innovative commentaries. We're moving right along. And they shifted their creative focus to a different kind of commentary, which involves analysis, interpretations, and among the leaders of these thoughts were some of Rashi's descendants, including Rashi's grandson and grandchildren, who came along and they started coming different analysis on the Gemara. And essentially what they did was they created a Gemara for the Gemara. The same way the Gemara makes all this analysis on the Mishnah, so they started making analysis on the Gemara and asking questions. Well, how could the Gemara say this? In another place it says this. The Gemara quotes this here, the Gemara quotes that there. Does this make sense? What about in this case? And they started asking all these questions. So Rashi is just giving you the simple explanation of what does the Gemara actually say. He's explaining the Gemara. The Tosfos is now coming with innovative interpretations of that. Sometimes they'll ask questions with Rashi and they'll say, Rashi, how could you explain the Gemara this way? Well, don't we have another Gemara which says the opposite of what you, Rashi, are explaining this Gemara say? Things like that. And it was their grandfather. Sometimes we're arguing with their grandfather, but that's okay. So they may challenge his interpretation, and then may proceed to offer an alternative understanding. And so let's go back for a moment to that page with Gemara. So we're going to zoom in here again. So this side is the Taisus. Okay, then we have the heading, and then they would continue on to deal with whatever the question at hand is. So Rashi and Tosfos is found on every Gemara page. So Tosfos is now creating this new genre of Talmudic scholarship. And this this is called Chidushim, means novel insights. And this becomes the dominant form of Talmudic scholarship using this style. So if you want to know what yeshivas are busy with, how could you study a page of Talmud for 7-10 hours a day, and maybe one page of Talmud for months on end? The answer is this, that they are constantly coming up with chidushim, with novel insights. And they weren't the only ones. You had many others that began to give similar interpretations. You had the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. You had, depending on which tractate it is, you may have many different explanations. Where did I see that number? Find that number somewhere. Anyway, so if you look at it, so this is called Chidushim. So, like I said, a classic Tosfos would raise a question, logical inconsistency, may offer an answer, and then may give a comment, may give an explanation, and so on. Text number 9. They made the Talmud like a ball, spinning it and rolling it from place to place until it was all smooth and interconnected. Tosfos refined the entire Talmud, smoothing it out, making it clear. Here it is. Oitzim Afarshei Talmud to Kiddushin, just in one tractate, Kiddushin. There's a collection of all the commentaries in Talmud, and they list about 1,200 volumes on one tractate of Talmud. On the entire Shas, remember what Shas means? What Shas mean? I remember that term, Shas? Shas, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, 6 tractates refer to both the Talmud and Mishnah, known as the Shas. There's estimated to be more than 10,000 titles of commentaries. So it's a lot to learn. Get working on it. Okay, so this is called Chidushim. So this is just one example, but as I said, there's so many more. And this is a journey that never ends. Talmud study and innovation is a journey that never ends, only advances. As the Mishnah tells us in number 10, then Mike said, turn it over and turn it over again, for it contains everything. It's referring to the Torah. Look into it, grow gray and old over it, and do not budge from it, for you have no better portion than it. As much as we study Talmud, you could always study it again, and you always find new innovations and new ideas, new questions and new answers, and always new hidden meaning. And in fact, the Medrash tells us that as long as you're studying diligently, you're part of the process of the Torah that God gave to Moses to Sinai. Take a look. Text number 11, the insights that a veteran student will in the future say in front of his teacher were all given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Meaning that whatever was given to Moses at Mount Sinai has within it the future ability to come up with these ideas in its probability. But we have to bring it out in actuality. And that's our job, to continue working the Gemara, continue working the Torah, to keep bringing out more and more insights and developments. How can you say it comes from Moses at Sinai? Moses just gave the Torah the way it is. How can you say it's from Moses at Sinai? Text 12a from the Rebbe says, seeing that all innovations in Torah must be built on the principles that Moses received from Mount Sinai, it emerges that all was given to Moses at Sinai. Nevertheless, when a veteran student toils with their mind to reveal specific idea within the oral Torah, an idea that accords with the Torah principles, they create something truly original in Torah. So if we work on it, we're able to come up with something truly original. So on one hand, it's a chiddush. On one hand, it's a novel concept. And at the same time, it's given to Moses because the ability to study these ideas, the guidelines for these ideas, the foundations for these ideas were given by Moses at Sinai. So you want to know what to study? Study where you feel your heart contents. If you feel something that speaks to you, we'll work on it. So the Torah is infinite, and there's always more. Because ultimately, who's the author of Torah? The author of Torah is God himself. God himself is infinite. And so the Torah contains infinite layers of meaning, and it's all part of the original author's intent. And so how can you say that there's two things that are saying the opposites and yet they're true? Could be. On different levels, the Torah could be true in different ways. And so this is the journey of becoming a veteran student. You have to continue to join the chain of Torah study, learning more and more each day. We shouldn't just be taking in information, but trying to learn, to trying and understand, ask questions, and coming up with new novel ideas. And so this is the key of the veteran students. In text 12b, the Rebbe continues, it says, it's every Jew has an obligation not only to study that which is already published in sacred books, but also to innovate and to come up with new ideas. The Rebbe actually encouraged yeshiva students, young students, 15, 16-year-old boys, to publish books where they are writing their own novel ideas. And yeshivas do this regularly. And you know, I have things that I wrote when I was about that age. If I look at it today, I'll probably laugh and say how silly it is. But, you know, this idea to continue and trying to innovate and to study more and to learn more is something which is not only an ability, but it's a mission that we all have. And take a look at a video here.
Preserving the past. And storage. That the Jewish nation itself at both fundamentally generating fresh interpretations of traditional text, because the Torah's ancient guidelines allow for endless originality and thought. In recent times, all publishers have treated the Torah's tradition of creativity with unprecedented innovation and song.
Поступове дирайся за добра и год, обеднегенство глютого фунети, и фунвен кола лите леса, и гитеус дава мерли, и в форма блу, а его блюла дегом де бените парнете, и вон дирите садеви, он рима да тива обиклоне хатеви, When you Waarom naar die miljoen, en naar ieder miljoen wat ik ein Kommissar sein. Und die haben es so sein, als seine Scheiße zu viel durchgeschwingen.
The Rebbe handed the keys of innovation to whomever studies Torah. He campaigned for students of every age and stage of knowledge to seek a good, clever, novel insight within all the classic works of the Jewish tradition and to publicize those discoveries.
Also, die Westmannschaft haben die Kenntnis, dass die Kinder, was die Marine, als ich die Aloha, Wissenschaft erleuchtet wird. Über Kultursachen, und du kriegst die Beispiele, was du in Wochen und Erwartung kannst, ich glaube, ich habe es auch viel, dann erwarten, was ich erwarten soll, ist war Kultur, ich.
Back in 1986, Rabbi Ruby New was the student who hesitatingly heeded the Rebbe's song. He submitted what he thought was an original challenge to a text of Rashi's commentary on the Torah in his yeshiva journal. His entry was then read. Rebbe insisted.
Question popped into my head, which I quickly suppressed. I thought that was thing, for the big leaguers. One of the members of the editorial board said, put all of those calculations aside. This is what everyone wants, so just write it. My question is the first one published because it's the first Rashi of Bamidbar. And then I see on the bottom a note from the editor, Rabbi Kalitsky. The question has been dealt with extensively by some of the classic commentaries on Rashi. Person who submitted the question did not take the time to do any research on looking to Rashi's commentaries. So, about being thrown under the bus. Anyway, the next day, it came to that point of the Farbrengen where the Rebbe was now going to talk about the Rashi. He said, the question was about the first speech. And we were like shaking like a leaf. He said, even though the commentaries address this issue, in light of the fact that the person who submitted the question also asked a similar question from the beginning of Persian, means that we therefore need to find a singular answer that can resolve the question both from the beginning of Midbar and also the Hod. The Rebbe proceeded to give a beautiful explanation as to both. But to bring in the first person that I looked for was Rabbi Galitsky. He said, no, the big smile on his face. He said, no, the Rebbe defended you.
Every Jew is encouraged to drink from the divine well springs of Torah wisdom. And every Jew is empowered to become a fountain of fresh Torah ideas.
Okay. So actually, in the 80s, that was something very common. The Rebbe wanted people to write questions and answers and their own ideas. And many times in the Farbrengen and the Shabbos Farbrengens, he would address those questions that were brought up, usually refuting the answers that were brought and give a completely different answer. That's usually what happened. But on occasion, you would get a green light. But of course, you're always happy if you're the one that wrote that question, and the Rebbe recognized that question, and that happened quite often. Now, to conclude the course. So in the beginning of the course, we shared a story in the 13th century France. We talked about them burning the Talmud, and we've learned over the journey what the Talmud is. That's the heart of Judaism. And over the past 1,500 years, our enemies have tried to destroy us. From the beginning, burning, banning, corrupting, and obliterating the Talmud, sometimes editing the Talmud. And this is something that we see even today. A lot of the anti-Semites out there, they have like this enjoyment of putting out their challenges to the Talmud. If you look in Twitter and Facebook and other pages, you see this pretty often, right? You know what I'm talking about. So at least we have to know what we're talking about. So generations of scholars, scribes, printers, and philanthropists also always work tirelessly to make sure the Talmud remains accessible to every Jew. So let's take a look quickly at what we learned. Number one, we learned the source of halacha. Talmud is the source of what halacha is, what Jewish law is. We talked about in lesson 1 that the Talmud is a way of communicating with God. It's a way that this is how God communicates his will and why it's so important. Lesson number 2, we talked about the oral Torah. We explained the oral Torah. It's God's message to us, and it's intended to be for us to study it. We talked about evaluating diversity, having the different views and opinions. In lesson 3, we talked about. In lesson 4, we talked about the deeper meanings after the Talmud's the teachings, deeper spiritual, philosophical, and ethical messages. And lesson 5, we talked about how to think like a Talmudist. And we actually went through an entire sugya. And now it's being given over to everyone here in this room and everyone in general, but especially those who are here in this room who joined me for this journey of learning what the Talmud is. Now it's our job to actually start studying the Talmud. In modern times, there's different approaches to study Talmud. You could join a class or study with a partner. You can find classes on Talmud on Chabad.org. Some do what's called Chalukas Hashas, where a group of students would break the Talmud up. I'm actually part of a Chalukas Hashas, which means they'll take the entire Talmud and break it up for the year. So text number 13, the mitzvah is performed by several people. Jointly, each participant is rewarded as if they had performed the entire mitzvah alone. For this reason, the entire Jewish people have embraced the practice of forming Chevra Shas, Talmud study clubs, for the sake of dividing the study of the entire Talmud between many individuals. So I joined, for example, all the Chabad rabbis in Florida. We split up the Talmud every year, usually the 19th of Kislev. So that's the first thing you could do, but you could join, take on one tractate to do a year, or even half a tractate to study some part of the Talmud. There's also a book, we talked about this in the past, called the Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is a collection of the Agadita sections, which is more for those who have a little more difficulty with studying the whole back and forth. This is more just the Agadita, which is just the lighter aspects of the Talmud. The truth is that it contains hidden and esoteric teachings of Judaism, but it's presented in a more simple way. You can learn a daf yomi. Daf means a page, which is, when we say a daf, it's a two-sided page of the Talmud. If you were to study the entire Talmud starting page, which means this is a daf. Daf means two sides. When you look in the Talmud, you'll see that it's actually this is, let's say this is page. Let's say this is page 3. So it'd be page 3A, 3B. That's the way the Talmud is made up. So when you read that there's 25 pages in the Talmud, it's actually 50 pages in the Talmud for this two sides. If you were to do if you were to learn one of these double sides a day, you would finish with nearly 3,000 pages. You would finish it in about 7.5 years. Some people do that; they do it every day. Some people study just a side a day, a half a daf, so just a side a day. That's called an amud. And then there's another thing which the Rebbe instituted, and that's the idea of studying Rambam, daily Mishnah Torah. And this is perhaps something that may be a little bit easier for most people. As we saw, the Rambam is more clear and concise. And as I said before, the Rambam tells us that you can literally go from studying the written book of Torah and go straight to the Rambam, and you have the whole Torah on your fingertips. Why is it better to learn, not what better, but what is the upside of learning Rambam as opposed to just learning the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law? Because the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, only talks about laws that are relevant in today's times. It was written long after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And so it's only things that are relevant today. But if you want to study the laws of all 613 mitzvahs, including those that are relevant to the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the time of the temple, and those that are relevant even before, biblical times or whatever, things that are relevant for all times, that is the Rambam. The Rambam codifies all 613 commandments. Now, the good news is that if you study 3 chapters of Rambam a day, which is not that hard, there are those here aside from myself that do it. It'll take you about 45 minutes a day to do it. There's classes that you can do it about 45 minutes a day. If that's too much for you, you can learn 1 chapter a day. We just have concluded the annual cycle. Those were here Shabbos. I made the Siyum Rambam, made the completion of Rambam here in the Shul on Shabbos. And I completed the annual cycle. So we just started the annual cycle. The annual cycle begins with the introduction to the Rambam, which we just read a lot of that introduction here. The introduction is a little bit longer. It's very interesting. It's something that I would encourage you to learn either way, the entire introduction to the Rambam. But you could study 1 chapter a day. 1 chapter a day is not long. It takes you max 15 minutes a day. You go on Chabad.org, they have about 5 or 6 different teachers teaching the Rambam. You could pick whichever style you like. You could listen to the daily chapter in your car, or when you're taking your walk or whatever you're doing. And this way you could finish the entire oral Torah. You have the entire oral Torah right there on your fingertips by studying the Rambam daily. If even that is too much, it's also split up to study at least a mitzvah a day. But then you're not really getting the full thing. But I would suggest to try and study at least 1 chapter of Rambam a day, if possible, even 3 chapters of Rambam a day. And if you say, Rabbi, I'm too old, I can't do this anymore. Well, you remember we talked about Rabbi Akiva? Well, let's read the story of Rabbi Akiva, text 14, for the final text of this course. How did Rabbi Akiva begin his journey to scholarship? Text 14. It is told that he was 40 years old and had never studied in his life. But he was once standing at the mouth of a well and asked, "Who carved the hole in the stone over here?" People there told him it was formed by the water that constantly drips into it, striking in the same spot day after day. Rabbi Akiva told himself, if a substance so soft can carve its way through material so hard, then surely the words of Torah are like iron, can engrave themselves within my heart, which is mere flesh and blood. He immediately set out to start studying Torah. He went with his young son, and they sat down before the teachers of the young children. Imagine, he sat before the teachers of young children. He said to one, Rabbi, teach me Torah. Then took out one end of the tablet, the son held the other end. The teacher wrote down Aleph and Bet for him. At 40 years old, he's learning the Aleph Bet. He studied those 2 letters. He continued studying until he had mastered the entire Torah. This is what Rabbi Akiva is learning from a stone. That if you toil, just like that water could get through that rock. You toil persistent, Torah is accessible to you. You also have translations. We have the translation of the Talmud. Learn a Talmud, start with a shorter tractate, an easier tractate. And you begin studying. And maybe if there's enough interest, maybe I could start a class on Talmud here as well. There's enough interest garnered to have a regular, maybe weekly class on Talmud. So that's something that, I'd love to consider. If we have enough people interested, could start with a tractate, maybe one that's a little easier, a little shorter. We were doing a Talmud class a little while ago. It ended with COVID, but if people are interested, we could begin studying Talmud inside and going through it. And the main thing is to continue studying Torah, and everything that we learned over the past 6 weeks should only be the beginning of studying and we shouldn't conclude it here, but we should continue on. Look out for the next course, which is about colorful characters as we see. That's going to be starting after Pesach.
6. The Talmud until today. 1. The Talmud's rulings became binding for the entire Jewish nation because they are the consensus of the sages and were accepted by the Jewish people worldwide. After its completion, Jewish communities were dispersed in exile. New halachic decisions by local rabbis were binding within their own communities, not universally. 2. Deriving halacha from the Talmud has always been challenging, and expert scholars were consulted for guidance through responsive halachic digests like the halachot of the Rif simplify the Talmud's discussions, making practical rulings more accessible by omitting lengthy debates. 3. Rambam's Mishnah Torah organized Jewish law systematically, offering clear presentations of halachic things derived from the Talmud. The Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo, with Rabbi Moshe Isserlis's glosses, became the most accepted code, incorporating numerous halachic opinions and addressing new questions and customs. 4. Rashi's explanatory commentaries help students understand the Talmud's complex, unpunctuated text. The Tosafot created by Rashi's students covered new depths of Talmudic insight by resolving questions and contradictions in the Talmud's text. 5. Torah innovations were already given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Every generation of scholars builds on previous ones, uncovering new insights and layers of meaning. Every Jew has the potential to contribute novel insights to the Talmud. 6. Today, there are various methods for studying Talmud, making the study of Talmud accessible to everyone. These approaches allow for both in-depth study and fast-paced learning, accommodating learners at all levels. 7. Rabbi Akiva's story inspires all Jews to pursue Talmud study regardless of prior knowledge. Each of us is able to begin the journey of scholarship.
For Talmud, for more insights and lots more. Thank you everyone for joining us.